During a luxury dinner, the Mafia boss found his maid freezing outside. The door was locked. Outside, she was already freezing, and the man who ordered the luxury dinner had no idea what was happening behind his house. The sentence landed in the room like an accusation. Crystal chimed, silk rustled, and laughter folded over the long table as if the words were nothing more than a ghost of conversation. Outside, the city had been swallowed by a white noise so angry it rattled the mansion's 100-year-old eaves. The storm had arrived like punishment. Wind flayed the pines, snow whipped at the lanterns, and the driveway disappeared into a seam of gray. Inside, the songhouse burned bright. Gold chandeliers, lacquered trays, the quiet choreography of a family practiced in appearances. Zara Williams moved through that light and habit like someone holding a fragile thing. She kept her eyes low, palms flat against the silver service tray until the last possible moment. The uniform she wore was black and thin. The mansion's warmth skirted her but did not find the chill she carried from the street, where she had learned to cover her hands with thrift store gloves and work twice as hard to appear untroubled. Her English rolled easily into Korean when necessary. On this night she translated menu items, smoothed napkins, took measured breathers in the kitchen corners where the staff kept a different set of rules. She had earned a scholarship to an urban university once, had read about finance and international trade in borrowed books, had spoken sentences in boardrooms no longer hers. Those details mattered less in the dining room. Tonight they were quiet credentials until someone in that room decided to need them. Sumin Song sat nearest the patriarch, a porcelain cup cradled like a scepter. Her handbook, silk, impossible blue, caught the light in every thin fold and announced her as the household's chosen style and standard. She had perfected a smile that cut, the kind that made people grateful for crumbs and ashamed of wanting more. Her voice, when she spoke, was small and precise enough to sting. "Zara," Sumin said in Korean, the command folded into civility. "My mother's jade. It must be found." Heads at the table lifted with the careless curiosity reserved for incidents that did not touch them. The family guests, business associates, distant cousins, a retired judge who laughed too loudly, watched the scene like they watched an evening performance. Detached, entertained. Someone at the far end made a joke about superstition. Someone else knocked a glass and did not care enough to apologize to the maid who retrieved the serviette. Zara nodded. She had seen the jade before, a small green disc threaded through an old woman's hairpin at the head of the table during the ancestral rites. To Sumin it was an ornament and a mark of one's place in the family ledger. To Zara it was another thing to find and be found wanting of if she failed. She moved towards the main doors. The foyer's marble was warm underfoot. The sound of laughter blurred into the mechanics of the house. Mrs. Park stood at the threshold, hands folded, eyes lowered, a steward of custom who had a role to manage and choices she had long since learned to make. Sumin watched them both with something like an artist watching models arrange themselves. "Don't come back until it's found," Sumin added, but the sentence had a different closing. She turned away as if nothing had happened, as if the sound of a command could be finished off like the flick of a chopstick. Someone laughed as though a curtain had closed on a scene. The guests resumed toasting fortunes and turning dishes, a theater of opulence that treated the world beyond its doors as a backdrop. When Zara reached the main threshold, the storm hit her like a physical thing. Wind drove snow into her collar. The sky threw itself against her face. The mansion's door seemed to breathe out heat and sealed itself like a lung closing. She crossed the stone path toward the garden, which had once been a place of careful landscaping and dry gravel, but tonight was a white plain where hedges swam like ghosts. Lanterns swung, their light smeared into starless smudges. The jade pin. She turned her gloves to look for the shape in her palm, found only the empty circle of cold. And then, because the command still sat behind her ribs, she began to search. There are small private humiliations that gather like snow. The body language of the rich, a look meant to remind the other of invisible debts. Sumin's command had been public, and so the humiliation followed Zara like a second garment. She moved along pathways that had known only the souls of the family and the servants who tidied myth from the marble. Her footsteps made a thin sound in the drift. Nothing else answered. The wind took her breath in short, panicked grabs. Fingers that had typed term papers, filled out scholarship forms, argued with professors about ethics and acquisitions, went numb with a speed that was out of the ordinary. Numbness is precise in its cruelty. At first it is frost, a tingling that sharpens thought. Then it erases edges, makes language slip like loose coins. She found no jade. She called the name, again, as ordered, but the word fell flat into the white. The mansion's lanterns were smaller now, and sound from the house lost its connection to the faces she had seen. A laugh drifted faintly, as if from a different world. When she tried the back terrace door, it resisted. The lock had already been turned. For a moment she thought it a mistake. Someone had cleaned and latched before her return. She knocked at the glass. It yielded nothing. Then she saw the imprint in the frost. A shoe track right up to the threshold, and then no break in the line. No open hand, no attempt to help. It was as though someone had led her there and walked away. Cold scratches a logic into a person's thinking. She tugged at the handle again, panicked now. Her breath came in short bursts that clouded the glass, and in the curve of her exhale, a dizzying sleepiness hovered near. A memory slipped into her mind. Her grandmother's hand. The seam of a coat mended with deliberate stitches. The way an elder's voice could ask you to steady your life like a balancing act. Her grandmother's small room in an apartment where the heater worked only when coins were placed in the slot, where soup had to be stretched for 3 days. Images that had hardened Zara into thrift and precision. She held the thought like a candle. But the candle flickered. Her fingers, once nimble with pen and calculator, and the keyboard of a campus lab, went loose and clumsy. She tried to call out. There was a sound, but it retreated immediately like a voice swallowed by the storm. She sat on the cold step, pulled her knees to her chest, and tucked her chin. The body is an instrument of survival until it submits to the weather. Then rational thought unplugs, and a person sinks into a narrower channel of sensation. Cold, pain, sleep. Hypothermia is not dramatic in the way movies love. It is a lowering of the thermostat inside a person until muscles fail and speech slurs. Her words blurred. Inside, a different ritual had replaced the winter. Chopsticks clicked, dishes were passed with gestures that looked like affection, and Minho Song presided at the head of the table with the sort of stillness that could be a speech. He was a man accustomed to the small mechanics of being obeyed without making a show of forcing it. Guests leaned toward him as though his silence could deport meaning into their cups. He watched his family in little bright strokes, the way Sumin adjusted her sleeve, the too bright laugh of Junho at a joke that had bled into aggression, the quiet of Tu tucked at the other end of the table like a younger, more watchful son. As the night moved, the house continued its mechanical memory. Servants glided, faces learned to be overlooked. Plates circled. No one asked where Zara had gone. That absence, small and human, slipped off the table like condensation, trickling unnoticed down the stem of a wineglass. At the far end, Junho poured another drink too fast. Sumin watched him with a look that was almost a calculation. He reached for her hand, and she withdrew it with the practiced coolness of someone who would rather keep hands for the map of succession than for affection. Minho observed them both, but not in a way that invited conversation. He had the habit of seeing what others dismissed and saying nothing until the time for saying was now. It was Sumin who suggested the lost jade was a portent, a bad omen, and the party's chatter thickened into the kind of gossip that devours people in silence. "My mother will be distressed," she offered in that blade-light voice, and the room nodded. A few servants exchanged glances in the kitchen. Mrs. Park mouthed an apology she could not make into speech. There were rules about who was visible. Zara had been made visible, and then, by design, rendered invisible at a distance. The storm tightened its grip. Snow piled against the door like a second skin. The house's warmth seemed to be held with the same kind of tight-fisted care with which someone hoarded money. Candles flared and then settled. Music played. No one noticed the absence of a single black-clad maid in the swell of aristocratic conversation, except one man. Minho let his gaze slide from the bright arc of Sumin's sleeve to the empty chair at the service end of the table. He watched the way the silver served its own shine, the way plates were placed as if someone else had moved them. It was a small thing, a missing actor on a stage whose script had been written decades ago. He had watched small things, always. For him, absence made a sound. He set his cup down, the motion deliberate, and rose. He moved through the house with a slowness that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with his constant rehearsing of control. Staff parted as he passed. Eyes dropped out of instinct. He did not speak until he reached the foyer, at which point the sound of the party was muffled by a distance that was not exactly soundproof. The corridor opened onto the main doors, and Minho saw the way the garden had gone white and how the marble steps had become an erased map. He did not bother to put on gloves. His hands carried a calm that had been hired and practiced in the quiet economies of his life. When he reached the terrace door, he found it locked and the glass rimed with frost. He frowned not for a petulant reason but for a practical one. A locked door without warning meant someone had arranged for it to be locked. There was intention in a locked door in a house like his. He turned and did something everyone in that house knew he could do, and that no one expected him to exercise without story. He struck the glass with the heel of his hand. It cracked in a web. He struck again, and the web opened into air. A shard slithered down into the thrown-up snow. Wind blew inside like an answer. The sight of Zara on the step was immediate and precise. She was curled into herself as though trying to be smaller than the storm. Her gloves were gone. Her hair hung with white in a pattern of neglect. Her face had lost the color that belonged to warmth. He crouched without thinking, he who rarely made sudden movements, and swept her into his arms like an object he had not known to miss until it was gone. For a long moment the only sound was the wind and the thin rattle of his breath, half of surprise, half of command. Inside, he carried her to the private rooms rather than the kitchen. The house's public anatomy was for show. There was a back of rooms where decisions were made and secrets kept. He placed her on a chaise, stripped the wet outer layer from her shoulders, and felt for the small things a doctor might notice. Her skin was pale with the sort of layered cold that begins where the warmth stops. His fingers found a narrow red mark at her wrists, faint at first beneath the snow of her hair. He frowned, and for the first time that night the sleep of the party ended. The guests' laughter thinned to the edges like confetti that does not know how to land. "Call Dr. Kim," Minho said, voice like a switch being turned. It was not exactly an order, as much as it was a seat placed for someone to take. Mrs. Park moved with the speed of someone who had been taught to move swiftly and without question in such moments. Her lips were set in the economy of someone who had been present at too many misfortunes to be surprised. They got a doctor. He arrived with the tired precision of someone familiar with the songhouse's rhythms. Dr. Kim had been the family's physician for 20 years. He had an understanding of people that smelled like antiseptic and old books. He assessed in the way of professionals, fingers on pulse, a glance at pupils, an index of temperatures. His examination was clinical, unemotional. He noted the numbness, the slurred words, the inability to place her hand properly. "Possible hypothermia," he said, voice low. "Shivering may cease soon. Dangerous sign. Bring her core up immediately." Minho watched as Dr. Kim administered blankets and warm compresses. The doctor uncovered Zara's wrists to inspect more closely and paused. The thin red crescents, indentations like the outline of a strap, appeared, and the doctor's professional face drew a line. "These aren't just from cold," Dr. Kim said. "There are abrasion marks, like bindings." Minho's jaw tightened. He had been a man whose hands bore the consequence of decisions, but this was a private violence executed with the small, intimate cruelty that defined certain people around his table. He had always been able to measure a threat by its scale. This was personal. Sumin arrived then, breathless with theatrical hurt. Her hair was a studied mess, as if she had been interrupted mid-performance and now expected applause for her distress. "What happened?" she asked, too loudly. Her voice tried to be ignorant, and was not. Minho steadied himself before he answered. He placed Zara's wet hair back from her forehead, feeling the fragile skin of someone who had nearly dissolved into sleep. The room was small and smelled of blankets and old leather. It did not smell like the dining room, which was a different sort of performance. "She was outside," he said. "The terrace was locked." Sumin's face shifted but did not break. She had practiced the look of being shocked. "Locked? Who?" "Someone locked it," Minho finished for her, slow, each syllable a stone thrown into a quiet pond. His eyes did not look at Sumin with accusation. He catalogued the possibility of guilt with a surgeon's steadiness. Zara blinked then, a fragile movement that made the scene tilt toward her. She tried to speak, and the words slipped like blocks of ice. Her voice was weak but present. "They," she said in halting Korean, then corrected into English because the room, despite its ceremony, had ears that judged accents. "They said there was a lost pin. They sent me to find it." She coughed. Her breath was a small fog. Dr. Kim's gaze flitted from the marks to Sumin, and then to Junho, who had appeared at the doorway with the arrogant confusion common to men who assumed their command extended through the house. Junho's smile was brittle. It searched for a way to turn the moment to something smaller than truth. "We were all inside," he offered, voice casual, as if to say everyone agreed to oblivion. Minho did not answer Junho. He turned his eyes toward Mrs. Park and then toward the hall, where the ancestral portraits watched in oil and varnish. There is a kind of public record that houses keep in frames. The family line, the faces that say we are more than the sum of our private indulgences. Minho's hand brushed the back of the chair, as if he were touching history and asking it to bear witness. Zara's teeth were chattering now, not from the cold alone, but from the shock that small injustices pull beneath the skin. She tried to place the memory of the garden, where she had found nothing, and then, with a sudden clarity, she remembered movement near the hedges. For a second she imagined being watched, and the image made her more alert than she had been in minutes. "Someone took my gloves," she said, and there was a mortified anger in the way the words fell. "My hands, they had been tied." That the word "tied" hung in the room like a rag put a new weight on the party's frivolity. The people who had been toasting fortunes felt their own skin. Even Suman's face seemed to harden for the fraction of a beat that could have been a confession if the world operated with the decency of small economies of honesty. Minho sat down across from Zara. For a man accustomed to calculating leverage, seating someone across was a kind of soft command. He did not give instructions that weren't necessary. He asked instead, "Who?" Zara hesitated. Names and accusations are dangerous. They are small incendiary devices in a house wired with loyalty and fear. She had seen ledgers and transfers once, enough to know an illicit path when she saw one, but the memory of paper was still a private thing. She swallowed, tried to make the English she used every day steady in a room that preferred its own language. "I saw," she started, then stopped. The sentence did not finish because the room did not yet allow her the safety to point a finger. Suman moved like someone sniffing for a hint of blood. "Are you accusing my children?" she asked. Tone sharpened. Eyes narrowed. There was a calculation there. To turn the house's gaze back toward a younger generation was to destabilize a throne. Minho's fingers tightened on the arm of his chair. He had watched the family trade favors and favors back like people who collected stamps. He had seen theft wrapped in excuses, like a plate wrapped in a napkin. He had seen Junho's hand in other deals. Reckless, teeth-bared, eager for a throne he did not deserve. But Suman's elegance was a public performance. If she had orchestrated something like this, it would be a different brood of truth. Dr. Kim spoke then, with the plain voice of someone used to facts and not drama. "The bindings left marks consistent with zip ties," he said. "There is evidence of forced removal of gloves and exposure. Hypothermia is severe. She needs warmth and quiet." Minho removed his coat and laid it over Zara's shoulders himself, an intimate action that said more than most speeches about responsibility, and then uncovered the phone on his desk. He did not call the police. He called instead the household's internal numbers, the people whose power lay in discretion and immediate solutions, the head of security, 2 trusted aides, a car to bring medical supplies, and his own private lawyer. His thinking ran like a machine with old oil. Public legalities could be messy, and draw attention in a way that would ruin children and reputations. He preferred, as he had always preferred, to handle the matter within the house first. He watched Zara's chest rise and fall. He had not expected the sight of her in that pose to unsettle him in a way he could not name. For years his decisions had been about numbers and territory, metaphors of power. But in front of him was a person who had been made small so that someone might feel larger in a dining room. It was a quiet cruelty with a public audience. It was the kind of wrong that breaks open the architecture of loyalty. "Who would do this to a servant?" Suman demanded, voice high now, the thinness of panic in it hardly veiled. Her hand trembled, not with regret, but with the possibility that she might be blamed. She looked at Junho, searching for fiction. Junho's jaw was hard. "No, it's ridiculous," he said too quickly. "Why would we?" Minho's gaze cut across them, a blade that did not need to move. He had the authority to let this pass into the house's whispered archives. He also had the authority to let it become public in ways that would unmake some of the people present. He weighed options with a man's habit. Everything broke into consequences. Zara, shivering under his coat, tried to explain further, a fragment of a sentence that suggested she'd been forced to the terrace at the direction of someone with proximity and authority. She mentioned Suman's hand motion as she sent her out, the way the door had been locked after Zara stepped beyond it. Her words were disjointed, edged with the sort of fear that makes one hesitate to point at a person who could, tomorrow, remove you from a country. Minho took a breath. He signaled for the security chief to remain outside and for Mrs. Park to be brought in. The list of those present would be simple but telling. The house ran on lists and ledgers, and he knew how to read them. "Leave us," he told the guests in a voice that did not ask. The dining room's ease snapped like thread. People left with the calculation of their own reputations trailing behind them. A few tried to mutter concern, flattered by his attention, but even their words faded into the suppressed crackle of the storm. The house drew inward. When the door to the private room closed, Minho sat in frustrated quiet, then leaned toward Zara. He studied the marks at her wrists again, the pallor of her skin, the slow clearing of her eyes. The man had no illusions about what his intervention signified. He had built a life on the idea that power was an instrument. But there is a difference between treating power as a tool and treating it as a moral obligation. One could buy silence. One could, with equal ease and different risk, choose to do something else. Zara lifted her head slightly and their eyes met. For a second he allowed himself a look at what she was. Not merely a maid wronged, but a person with a story he did not yet know. He had seen many faces in his life. Few had the steadiness of the one before him. Her education and rough experience had carved a dignity into the way she held herself, even in the collapse of hypothermia. It made his decision heavier and, in a way, simpler. "Can you tell me who locked the door?" he asked, careful. She tried to force the memory into the shape of a name. Sumin told me to find it. She told me to look for the jade," Zara said. The words were a pinprick of accusation. She coughed. Her voice dropped lower, like someone turned down a lamp, and she added, I'm not sure who closed it." Minho studied her face as if he could read a ledger there. He thought about what it meant to have a member of his house at the mercy of its lesser tempers. He thought about the ledger of loyalties that had always balanced in the song name. Favors owed, heirs slighted, betrayals tucked into shoeboxes. He had tolerated a certain violence for the sake of preservation. The violence that blurred into personal cruelty had always made him uneasy, but unease had been a private thing. A faint knock announced Dr. Kim's return with a small medical tray. He tightened the blanket around Zara and checked for frostbite, then looked up with an expression that did not like what he saw. "The marks," he said again. "They suggest deliberate action. Someone bound her. The absence of gloves worsened the exposure. We need to warm her and watch her." Minho's eyes lingered on the door before he closed it. Responsibility has a way of choosing the person it wants to inhabit. He saw, suddenly, and with a clarity that made him feel older than he was, the choice between cleaning the stain privately, moving Zara out quietly with protection and a new name, or exposing the stain in a way that would shake the house. He could feel the pressing weight of reputation in one hand and the fragile life of a woman who had been thrown out into a storm in the other. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small battered object, and set it on the table. A thin slate of jade from his own collection, not the family heirloom, but a token he kept for reasons he had not yet explained to anyone. He laid it within Zara's reach as a kind of promise he did not yet understand. She blinked and tried to focus on it. Minho left the room then, for reasons nobody else in the house would see as a decision, and walked back toward the dining chamber with a new hardness around his mouth. He let the party's noise wash over him like a sound he had heard too often. He stood near the doorway and watched Sumin rearrange herself as though nothing had happened. Junho hovered close, trying to read his father's face like a book he had every right to edit. Sumin's eyes met Minho's. She gave him a smile that meant this was a problem made small, that it would be contained. He returned no smile. He had the power to accept her reassurance, to pretend the night had been merely a spectacle, or he had the power to pull the opposite lever, to make the house account for itself. He chose to walk back to the private rooms rather than stay to witness the rest of the banquet. In quiet, he thought the problem through the way he always did, as a matrix of consequences. He knew who could have gained from making Zara vanish for a while. He knew who might have found advantage in a household's moment of shame. There were names that fit the pattern, but Minho was not a man to throw names before facts. He had, for decades, let his actions speak. Back in the private room, he found Zara asleep in the edged piece of someone not yet returned from a country of cold. Dr. Kim hovered, taking a quiet record that would exist only in the house's files. Minho observed the red crescent on her wrists and thought of the small indignities of domestic life, the invisible ledger that measures worth in service and not in personhood. He considered what a genuine act of protection would require. Protection could be quiet. It could also be loud, and loud risked more than friends were willing to lose. He sat near Zara, watched her breath find rhythm, and felt the old machinery of his life, territory, power, legacies, shift slightly under the weight of a decision. He had to decide what kind of patriarch he would be, one who preserved facades, or one who sometimes broke them for the sake of someone who could not pay him back in loyalty. The storm outside continued to beat its wings against the glass, as if the world had not yet decided which side it favored. The house held its own breath. If you want the whole story of how a house of power was forced to change, stay with us. Minho did not sleep that night. The house kept its own watch, shutters thumping, the furnace sighing against the cold. But the private rooms were lit by a lamplight that made paperwork seem more real than the silvered laughter from hours before. He sat in the study with his coat still over the back of the chair and watched Dr. Kim make notes on a pad that would stay in the house's private file. The doctor moved like a man trained to name danger rather than to narrate it. His handwriting was tidy and deliberate. Zara slept on the chaise, blankets tucked to her chin, the jade tile beside her palm like a small foreign promise. Her breath had steadied. When she shifted, a thin, disoriented murmur escaped her. Minho listened without the expectation of being changed. He listened because he had learned that silence softened nothing and sometimes taught the shape of a necessary act. Mrs. Park hovered in the doorway, hands clasped. Her face was a ledger of small loyalties, and tonight a new line had been written on it. She had been present for cruelties and comforts, for small reconciliations, for quiet indignations. Her eyes met Minho's, and in them was a question about what the house now intended to be. "Make the arrangements for her grandmother," Minho said finally, low and precise. "A private room, care, funds transferred into a trust under my name. No notices. Do it through the agency we use for family matters." Mrs. Park nodded, the motion that said she had been heard. She moved to execute the order with the swift obedience of someone who had navigated the house's rules for decades. Minho turned then to Dr. Kim. "What else?" "A bruise pattern consistent with zip-tie binding," the doctor replied. "There may be no criminal case filed, if you intend to handle this internally, but document everything. If you want to remove suspicion, do it right. Medical records, witness statements, the security log for tonight." Someone turned the terrace lock after she stepped out. The lock shows external manipulation. Minho's face registered nothing as he absorbed the professional grammar of the crime. Evidence, causation, chain. He was comfortable translating threat into action. He asked for the security roster, bank reconciliation reports, and the household logs. He told the security chief to sequester cameras' raw footage and to bring him the recent transfers of funds out of family accounts into any shell corporations linked to Junho or Sumin. The security chief bowed and left, knowing better than to argue when Minho asked for certain things. When Zara woke, hours later, it was to warmth and the faint scent of tea. She blinked at the light and the quiet faces around her as if she had stumbled into a gentler world. She tried to stand, and a hand steadied her shoulder. Minho was there, more a silhouette than a man, his suit sleeves rolled. He did not smile. He had never been lavish with such gestures. His eyes, however, held the kind of attention that read a person like a page. "Can you tell me everything you saw?" he asked. There was no flourish in it, no eagerness to dramatize, but he listened as if words were currency he intended to spend. Zara recounted the night in small, careful sentences. She spoke of Sumin's instruction, of the locked door, of the snow, of the way Junho's laugh had been off-key. She told him the most important piece last, about the box of documents she had seen tucked in a drawer behind a ledger in the study when she had been asked to clean there. They were not neatly stacked. They were marked with account numbers, names of shell companies, and transfer orders. She had taken a photograph with her phone, intending to show the pattern of weirdness to someone she could trust. That phone, she realized in a panic, had been taken from her at some point and returned empty of pictures. She remembered the glare of a lamp on paper, and then the shadow of a hand that had snatched the device. Minho's jaw tightened as she described the documents. If there was a vein that ran through the family's private life, one that had nothing to do with ancestry or ceremony, but everything to do with cold, calculated removal of wealth, then he had finally been shown its source. He thought of his ledger, the houses, the companies, the vigor with which he had once built barriers around decisions. He thought of the jade he kept, now a symbol in someone else's hand. "Who had access to the study?" he asked. "A handful," Zara said. "Sumin came often when she chose. Junho came with a man from the investment office last month. The housekeeper sometimes took parcels there for the patriarch. I was not supposed to clean behind the older desk. But when Mrs. Park asked for help that day, I saw—" She trailed, and Minho filled the silence with a gentle nod that asked for completion. "A ledger of transfers," Zara said. "Transfers to accounts in names I didn't recognize. And a note, Junho's handwriting, about moving the children and liquidating." Minho heard the word and felt its weight. Liquidating, an ugly term, meant converting assets to something portable. He had seen similar language in cables and contracts that had not yet touched a moral center. The fact that it had been written by his son made a new geography of betrayal open in the room. Not merely theft, but a treason flavored by familial ambition. He ordered the staff to secure the study and not to allow anyone in without his express written permission. He kept Zara with him and asked her to sit in the warmer rooms, to drink soup, to let the body mend. Mrs. Park obeyed with the thoroughness of someone who had kept 1,000 secrets. But there was also a look in her eye now that suggested a recalibration of loyalties. By the morning, the house had become an instrument for quiet retribution. Minho instructed the security chief to pull the camera footage from the study and the terrace for the previous weeks. He asked for vehicle logs, for the driver's accounts, for any receipts for offshore transfers. He told Dr. Kim to compile an official report of Zara's condition that could be filed in the household ledger. He asked his lawyer to draft non-disclosure materials, not to silence as punishment, but to corral information until he chose to release it in a manner that would serve order. He did not yet speak of banishment. That word, heavy and ceremonial, was a thing to be used with the same precision he used for signatures. But he had already decided that if the evidence held, the family would be altered. Sumin was not idle. Word moved through the servants' quarters like a rumor that had been planned as a weapon. She visited the private rooms with the affected air of a woman whose hurt had been grotesquely misunderstood. She wore a robe that still suggested silk and the world she wanted to keep. She flitted to Minho as if grief were a performance and placed a hand upon his sleeve. "This is absurd," she said low, eyes wide and wet with an artful grief. "We will make this right. Zara can be moved away, of course, so she will no longer cause us embarrassment." Minho listened and did not reply. He let her words pass like a blade across a table that had been cleaned. Sumin's calm, for all its polish, betrayed impatience. She wanted to contain the ripple before it became a tidal change to the bedrock of her household. Hunho, petulant and restless, paced in the outer room like a man waiting for a verdict he assumed would favor him. He tried to meet Minho's eyes and to find in them the indulgence he had always expected. The indulgence was not there. Minho's face was a careful mask. Junho's temper went shallowly from surprise to anger to a cold, calculating fear. When the security footage came in, Minho watched it with the intimacy of someone examining a wound in order to know how to treat it. The camera recorded the study over the prior month. Sumin entering at odd hours, Yunho with the investment man transferring files into a locked briefcase, a courier leaving the house with a small box wrapped in paper. There were sequences, conversations, a man making notes, an appointment set at the bank for private withdrawal. There was, too, a brief clip of Mrs. Park pausing by the study door and then continuing her duties. Minho watched all of it and did not flinch. "Who gave the order to lock the terrace tonight?" he asked the security chief. "It was done remotely from the household network," the chief said. "We traced the command to a remote access key fob registered in Junho's name, but someone else could have used it. We found evidence that the code had been used in a pattern matching the time Sumin used the study." Minho's face hardened in the way a person's jaw does before they deliver a sentence. He took the footage, the transfer ledgers that showed payments to shell accounts matching family assets, the encrypted emails that hinted at offshore plans. On top of that, there was a kernel of humiliation. His son, who had been raised to command, had been positioned to flee with resources and offspring, leaving the house with a hollow where continuity belonged. He called Zara to his side and showed her fragments of evidence. He did not intend to alarm her. He intended to give her the truth she had been denied, and with it the agency to choose how she would take her life forward. "You have a choice," he told her, his voice even. "You can enter a witness relocation program. No one here will contact you. We will arrange for your grandmother's care, a new identity, funds to live quietly. Or you can stay and work for me as my assistant. I will train you to be an advisor. You will be protected by the house. You will be recognized, given a new position and compensation. But this will be public within our walls, and it will put you within the center of the danger." The two options hovered between them like two doors, each closed for different reasons. The first promised privacy at the cost of vanishing. The second promised status and danger in equal measure. Zara's throat worked. Her mind, still fuzzy from cold, sought calculations and found only loyalties. "If I leave," she said, voice small, "they will follow me. Junho knows where my grandmother lives. He can—" Her words broke. She imagined the cheap apartment, the heater that worked only intermittently, the man at the front desk who had been paid for silence before. She pictured the frail back of the woman who had sewn clothes and kept dime-store rice for 6 months, who had told Zara once that the world had room for people willing to work. Minho's expression softened, imperceptibly. He did not produce promises he could not keep. He produced instead the means by which the house could shelter a life. "If you stay, I will place your grandmother in a private care arrangement under my name. I will see that she has medical care, a private physician, and funds. If you choose to leave, my protection will be quieter, but it will not be the same. We cannot guarantee the outside. You understand my meaning." Zara held his gaze and thought about the small green polish of the jade stone beside her hand. She thought of the ledger in the study and the image she had once made on her phone, a record of theft, of names detached from their consequences. She thought of the woman who had raised her on parsimony and pride, and of the risk that promised not only safety, but a new life in which she might be visible rather than invisible. "Will you guarantee they won't come after my grandmother?" she asked, hopeful and skeptical at once. Minho's answer was the kind of truth he had always used, not a promise of legal certainty, but a demonstration of power. "If they do, they will do so against me." It was a simple sentence, and in it lay a dukedom of protection. It was not a legal promise. It was an assertion of the fact that this house had will and resources, and that Minho could make the cost of harm high. Zara thought about it for a long moment, and then she said quietly, "I'll stay." It was not a decision made for love or prestige. It was a decision made out of duty to the person who had taught her to hold a needle steady until fabric bowed. It was also a decision to change the terms of what a family could be within the walls of the songhouse. Sumin heard the choice as an affront. She felt the edge of scandal approaching and moved to extinguish it in the only way she knew, by attempting to intimidate. She found an opening in the afternoon, a private moment when Minho was on the phone with a manager and Zara was reviewing documents. She entered the private room and closed the door with theatrical care. "You will ruin everything," she whispered, voice steeped in menace, not sorrow. "Do you know what this house loses if you make this a spectacle? Your son will be ruined, the family's name." Minho did not look up. He had the practiced patience of a man who had listened to many threats and had learned which to answer. "What do you want from Zara?" he asked. Sumin's eyes flashed. "I want what is ours. I want the position that will keep our children safe. Keep your maid and you will be the subject of gossip. If you do not do what is right." She let the threat hang like a weapon. It was not explicit. It never was. What she offered instead was leverage, incriminating gossip, the prospect of scandal, the implied hazard to the lineage. It was the sort of pressure that made men measure the weight of reputation against the squeal of conscience. Minho rose then, and he did something that had become his measure of authority. He removed the jade tile from his drawer and placed it on the table between them. He did not hand it to Sumin. He placed it where both could see. "If this house is to be preserved," he said, voice low, "it will be because I preside over it. You overplay your hand, and you will be removed from the inner table. I will do it as the head of this family." Sumin's face fell in a precise, wounded way that could be read as fear. She left then with the soft sound of fabric and the knowledge that Minho was not the sort of man who made idle promises. With Zara in his confidence, Minho began to turn the house into an instrument of discovery. He assigned security to follow the money trail discreetly. Accountants were contacted, shell companies traced, the bank's private relations department sent secret requests for records of transfers. He used the household influence with discretion, agreements, favors, quiet phone calls that in other circumstances might have been ugly. He told his lawyer to prepare documents that would allow the family to sever financial ties with anyone proved to have acted in bad faith, to invalidate certain transfers on technicalities the law permitted. The evidence mounted: transfers to an investment vehicle in a neighboring country, authorization codes written in Junho's hand, a courier schedule that matched the dates Sumin had spent in the study, a recorded conversation between Junho and the investment man confirming a plan to move funds and bring the kids out before questions. The security chief found an audio file of Junho telling an associate that he'd clear the house and put a lock on the back for a night when the timing suited them. It was not a legal indictment, it was proof of intent. Minho did not spring into public action. He thought of the ancestral hall and of the ceremony it contained. He knew that to change a house required not just justice, but narrative. He scheduled a family assembly for the following week, a formal gathering in the ancestral hall for a ritual that the family observed at New Year. He would reorder the ritual and use its gravity to deliver a judgment. He wanted the family and the household to witness the consequence of betrayal. Word leaked, as it always does, in the way people let it leak when they have to choose between protecting themselves and responding to a better measure of truth. Mrs. Park moved like someone who had been trusted with a secret and now felt a different allegiance. The kitchen staff glanced at Zara with new eyes. The house felt otherwise, smaller, more honest, less given to comfortable illusions. When the family gathered in the ancestral hall, the building's old beamwork seemed to lean in as if to listen. The room smelled of wood polish and the faint sweetness of incense, an aroma associated with memory and with choice. Portraits in oil watched from their frames. The ceremonial table was laid with the precision of a ritual, white cloth and bowls arranged in a line that marked continuity. Minho stood before them, not as a man out to crush, but as someone intent on redefinition. He had called the meeting as patriarch, and everyone present felt the weight of the ceremony. Sumin arrived in a hanbok chosen to speak probity. Junho scowled as he took his seat. Tu sat quietly, the younger son whose face bore the look of someone who watched and learned. The guests, distant cousins, business partners, and people who had been invited to witness social continuity, occupied the outer rows like flotsam. Zara was seated to the side, subtly elevated, a position calculated by Minho that would make her visible without making the spectacle of her presence crude. Her hands were folded and her face was steady. She had spent the week learning the names of accounts, repeating terms in Korean and English until she could call them without flinching. She had read the salty, dry prose of ledger entries and the cold shorthand of transfer memos. Her competence made her an instrument of truth in a room that relied upon its own illusions. Minho began the ritual with the ancestral incense, a small series of gestures that bound the present to the past. He then set the tone with a sentence he had prepared. "A family is a ledger where trust should be counted," he said. "When trust is withdrawn, names must be corrected." He presented the evidence like a man laying out a map. He had medical records, he had the security footage, he had the recorded conversations and the transfer statements. He did not shout. He put the facts before those who had the most to lose and allowed the truth to unfold. Sumin's face shifted color as the collected items were presented. The room felt like a bowl catching a light that had been refracted by the evening. Junho's bravado slipped. His fingers dug into his knees. "And yet," Minho said, turning, "the greatest violation is not in the stealing of assets. It is in arranging the harm of another, forcing a person into danger so that you may feel secure." He described, without theatricality, the zip-tie marks, the locked terrace, the photograph that had been taken and then erased, the courier who had carried off documents in the weeks before. He showed the transfer statements, sums moved to a company in a small jurisdiction with no physical presence, an account whose beneficiary had the same initials as Junho's alias. He read a passage from a recorded conversation where Junho and his associate spoke plainly of moving children and funds overseas. The ancestral hall listened like a jury. Faces reddened, gasps were muffled, men looked at their shoes. For people raised to pride, the quiet humiliation of being shown up in such a place cut deeper than any raised voice could. Minho then gave the family a choice disguised as a ruling. He would not allow the matter to be resolved merely as an internal argument or as an extraction of money. He asked Sumin and Junho to stand and to answer to the family. They did. Sumin's voice began with a practiced denial. "These are fabrications," she said. "I would never—" Junho tried bluster, and then lowered his head as documents played back his own words. He had a look that betrayed a certain modern arrogance. He had the notion that the house's ties could be stretched without breaking. They were wrong. Minho's next move was ceremonial and decisive. He reached for the family's register, a wooden book kept in the ancestral hall, names inked across its pages, each one a record of belonging. He took a page and, with a steady hand, crossed out Sumin and Junho's names in the sense that mattered for this household. He did not destroy them. Legal erasure would be more complicated. But he declared them banished from the inner circle, stripped of the privileges he bestowed as patriarch. He instructs that the family will not house them, not host them in public, not seat them at the table, and that their voice would no longer shape the house's decisions. It was a symbolic act wielded with the force of a man who knew how to shape reputation. The official banishment would be expressed through the household rules. No access to family funds, no custody of the property, social removals that were unbreakable in their domain. Minho did not pronounce exile in terms of law. He remained careful to avoid creating an impression of extrajudicial violence. But the banishment within the family was a different kind of law, binding and immediate. The room shifted. Some murmured that the patriarch had acted with mercy. Others grumbled that he had gone too far. Tu, the younger son, bowed his head, and then looked at Zara with a new measure in his eyes. He would learn the architecture of power differently now. Sumin's fury had a different quality, not the hurt of a wronged woman, but the baffled disbelief of someone stripped of entitlement. Junho's face flushed with a rage that had no relief. They were told to leave the household that night. They were given a day to gather their personal effects, and then to be escorted off the estate with dignity. It was a merciful form of humiliation. There would be no bloodshed, no public scandal perched on the headlines. Minho had engineered a punishment that aimed at the very currency they had traded in: privilege. Zara watched all of this with a caution born of experience. She kept her face composed because she had been taught that dignity measured a person in the small gestures, the way one thanked a person for service, the degree to which one accepted help without shame. When Minho rose and in a rare public gesture said aloud that Zara would step up to a new role, her voice shaky but her posture straight, she felt the room tilt. She was no longer merely a subject of pity. She was an asset in the invention of a new family. Zara has proven more loyalty to this house than some born to its name, Minho said. She will serve as my advisor on matters of language and business that have implications for the house. She will be paid. She will be protected. She will represent an idea we have neglected, that leadership is responsibility. The applause that followed was thin, polite, but it was real. Hands in the crowd rose like petals. Sumin wept theatrically and left with Junho. Their departure was watched rather than exalted. The house then pivoted to make amends in smaller, practical ways. Minho ordered that wages of household staff be reviewed and increased, that medical benefits be extended, that servants be provided with a small stipend for cold weather. The change was not a sweeping social reform. It was instead a recalibration in a household that could now see its human parts as more essential than its antique finery. In the weeks that followed, Zara's position shifted from servant to assistant. She moved her belongings into a modest room above the study, was given a small office, and began to study the family's enterprises with Minho. He taught her the names of accounts, the ways that power flowed through soft hands, and the method of measuring risk. She taught him quietly and efficiently how to read a modern ledger and translate its meaning across borders. They worked in the long hours that had once been signifiers of loyalty, and their conversations, once brief and transactional, grew into an exchange of mutual competence. She corrected a term here, questioned a transfer there, and in doing so pulled the house toward a cleaner, more accountable economy. There were consequences outside the household's ability to control. Word of the banishment moved in the arroyo of social gossip, picking up slivers of rumor. Sumin and Junho attempted to appeal to allies, to stir the old networks that protected those who had lost home. But the family's move had been swift and careful. Minho had understood that change required speed. He used the household's influence privately to make sure the children, his grandchildren, were cared for. He did not sever their connection entirely, but he made clear that blood did not grant entitlement without character. The children, bewildered, found a new equilibrium in the absence of Sumin's domineering certainty. Zara's grandmother arrived under the hush of protection. Mrs. Park escorted her in private, and Minho ensured the arrangement was discreet and dignified. The old woman, small and fierce, took to the quiet house with a stubborn gratitude. She called Minho son once, and he accepted the word like a patient person accepts a new truth. He provided a modest apartment under a health trust and arranged medical visits and a home nurse who came twice weekly. Zara visited daily, sometimes bringing soup, sometimes bringing a book to read aloud in the old woman's halting voice of memory. The grandmother's chest softened with the knowledge of safety. She regained weight, color, and the ability to sleep without fear of the night. The months that followed were not a story of perfect transformation. The house still contained old dynamics. Power could not be remade overnight, but small changes accrued. Staff spoke more openly in the kitchen. Minho's public appearances included a few gestures of philanthropy. Zara, who had been taught to read numbers in borrowed light, began to study accounting in earnest, her education becoming a resource she now used not to survive but to help steer the house. She taught younger staff to prepare for adulting, to understand bank accounts and savings, to demand contracts and not simply accept silence. 1 year later, the new year came round with a different shape. The mansion's lanterns glowed in the winter air, but the celebration had a new modesty. There were fewer ostentations of wealth. Instead, there was a seat reserved for people who had once been invisible. The ancestral hall was cleaned, and the incense burned with care. Minho presided, older perhaps, but less remote. Zara stood at his side as he called for a reading of the year's accounts, not as a temptation, but as a sign of transparency. There were small changes in attire. Less aggressive silk on the table, more muted tones, but gestures carried more meaning than fabric. At the main table, Minho placed a small velvet cushion. The ancestral jade, the pin that had been lost and that had become the anchor of a night's cruelty, was returned to him by an anonymous guest who had found it last winter in the snow. He placed it carefully on the cushion and then took Zara's hand, his movement deliberate, and pinned the jade to the lapel of her modest dress. It was a gesture of ownership that did not imply property. Rather, it told the room that the house had been reforged. "You did not ask for this," he said, voice softer than it had been in the ancestral hall. "You were given choices and you stood by the people you loved. Today the house names a new authority." There were quiet bows from the family and a clatter of polite music. Zara's grandmother sat close by, calm and proud. The staff watched from the sidelines with a kind of affectionate, astonished approval. Tu, Minho's younger son, offered Zara a small, genuine smile, a tiny reconciliation between old blood and chosen loyalty. Zara felt the jade warm against her chest. It was not a talisman of fate, but a token of survival, and a sign that small, decisive gestures could alter the course of a life. She thought of the night the storm had tried to erase her. She thought of hands tied and glass broken, and a man's quiet decision that had placed a blanket over her body and the house into motion. She thought of the grandmother who had mended rags into clothes that kept hunger from the child's bones. She thought of the ledger in the study that had once been a weapon. As the candles were relit and the music rose like an old promise, Minho sat back and watched the room. He had not become a saint. He did not claim such illusions. The house still had debts, and the world outside still required hard decisions. But the decision to show compassion had not erased the consequences of earlier choices. It had reshaped the instruments of power to include, now, a measure of responsibility. Later, after the dinner had thinned and lanterns were wound down, Zara and Minho stood alone on the terrace for a moment, listening to night birds that made the cold air bright with sound. The mansion behind them hummed, a living memory. "You could have left," Minho said. Not a question but a statement reflecting the man he had been and the man he was trying to be. Zara looked out at the dark and considered the storm that had once almost taken her life. "I could have," she answered. "But this house is where my life learned to move. It is also where my grandmother was unsafe. I chose to stay because I wanted to protect her, and because I wanted to know if the people with it could change." Minho's face was a landscape of small reliefs. "Then make them change," he said. He meant it as a charge. He meant it as an invitation for the person he had elevated to use the authority he had given her, not to entrench herself, but to reform. Zara, who had once hidden books under a pillow to read late, smiled for the first time that night, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who knew she had survived not by being chosen, but by choosing. The years that came after were not simple. Junho and Sumin attempted to make lives outside the house, bruised by loss of privilege. Some social circles closed to them. They found the air thinner, negotiation harder. They learned what it meant to be untethered from the narrative they'd assumed was their due. The household adjusted. Minho aged and softened in ways that were visible in the way he spoke to his staff, and in the modest philanthropic efforts he quietly funded. Zara's presence at the table became a steadying force. She used her position to argue for better conditions, to propose education stipends for staff children, to insist on transparent oversight where before there had been secrecy. On the anniversary of the night the storm had bared the house's underbelly, Zara visited the terrace at dusk. She ran a finger over the place where the snow had once melted into her footprints, feeling the roughness of a moment that had changed everything. She thought of the jade, warm now in its new setting, less a relic and more a reminder that survival could be transformed into a position to protect others. Minho found her there, leaned on the railing, and for a moment the two of them watched the city lights. He had done something simple and monumental. He had chosen protection over cover-up. He had defined his leadership not by the preservation of family wealth at all costs, but by the measured use of that wealth to repair what had been broken. "Family is what you choose to defend," Minho said at last, not as a maxim, but as a lived fact. "It is not always the blood which binds." Zara nodded. "Sometimes family is the person who picks you up and does not let you fall again," she said. They stood there in the falling light and let the sound of the city come to them, a steady, indifferent hum that had nothing to do with their small decisions and everything to do with the long arc of life. The jade pin on Zara's chest was a small thing, but it was heavy with meaning. It signified survival and dignity, an improbable belonging formed in a house of wealth and cruelty, turned toward an imperfect but earnest compassion. If this story asked anything of those who had watched it unfold, it would be this: who in your life has redefined the meaning of family for you? Share their name, their face, the small thing they did, and keep the memory of that kindness alive.